Welcome to this Find a Cure webinar on what does early access actually mean, which is the big question that we're going to be answering for you today. We're really excited today to be having a really collaborative webinar. There's loads of people in our virtual room. I will be hosting today's webinar, joined by Rick. I couldn't fit his picture in, so I'm sorry, Rick, but you're not on the slide. So he's my co-host today. And then we're joined by Josie Godfrey, who is a trustee of Metabolic Support UK, Naomi Litchfield, who is Patient Advocacy Manager at Bionical Emas, and Liz Ryburn, who is Support Services Manager at Spinal Muscular Atrophy UK. So as I said, a really exciting collaborative webinar for you all today. And this is just today's schedule for what we're going to be covering. So after my brief introduction, Naomi is going to kick us off by talking about what early access programs actually are and why you should care. And then Josie is going to take over and talking about the role that patient groups can play in engaging in early access programs. Liz will give a patient perspective, and then we'll finish up with some top tips and a Q&A session so you can ask all of your questions. So some of the aims of today are we're going to cover the basic principles of early access programs, the value of early access programs to both success of early access programs, and we want you by the end to have a better understanding and more confidence should the opportunity present itself for you, and you want to go forward with early access programs. We want you to feel more confident by the end of this webinar, and we will be checking up on that by the end.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Apologies for that. So, hello everyone, I'm Naomi Litchfield. I'm absolutely delighted to speak to you here today. So I lead patient advocacy at Bionical Emas, which is a CRO. CRO stands for Clinical Research Organisation, and we specialise in early access, which is often shortened to EAP. A lot of our early access programmes are in rare disease, and I'm extremely passionate about working in rare disease and have been for some time now. So my background is clinical research nursing. I went into nursing because I was inspired by my younger sister and the care that she received. She survived 4 rare different types of cancer, and her care was quite long and complex, and it was ultimately compassionate use therapy that saved her life. So I was fortunate enough to go on to work at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, and it was there that I was privileged to care for many patients and families with rare diseases, and really saw the devastating impact these cruel diseases have. But also I got to administer a lot of investigational medicine, and some of them had life transforming effects, which was really exciting. So in my current role, I'm fortunate enough to work with lots of different patient organisations like Find a Cure and Metabolic Support UK, and I do lots of different patient activities that are internal and external, but ultimately I'm responsible for ensuring that all of our patients and families on our early access programmes have a positive experience. So I'm just going to start from the beginning and give a high level kind of overview to what early access is. And I'm going to start with the terminology because it can be quite confusing. So EAP, early access programs, that's the term that we use at Bionical, but I'm sure you've all heard lots of different terms. I've put a few for you to see on the screen, but different companies and different countries use different terms. So hopefully you've heard of Emas. But if you haven't, it is a UK scheme, the Early Access for Medicine scheme, that was launched in April 2014. And I won't steal Josie's thunder because she's the next panellist and she's going to be talking in more detail about that. Expanded access is the term used in the US with the FDA, and special access scheme is actually the term used in Canada. And then other umbrella terms like compassionate use or pre-approval access, manage access are used by different companies and in different countries. And just to confuse you more, there's also different regulations in different countries and different routes, and a cohort route might be used for a group of patients and named patient might be used for one patient. But the good news is there is work being done to try and simplify this and make a glossary and have a more patient-friendly document, and as soon as that's available I will definitely share it with you. But just to highlight that early access or pre-approval, or ever deemed that you might term it, is a pathway to investigational medicine that is you're unable to enter a clinical trial because you're not eligible and there's nothing approved available to you. So there we go. I'm going to start on my next slide. Can we all see it? So this is the environment. The environment's changed quite a lot over the last, 10 years since I've been working in rare disease. There was few and far between, but now there's increasing in numbers and more access programs are happening, which is really exciting and encouraging. And I think more patients and families and advocacy groups like yourselves are learning more. And quite rightly, you're more demanding for access, because if you can't get into a clinical trial because of the very strict inclusion-exclusion criteria, there's very little options if there's nothing approved to you. So all I would say was be brave, keep asking, and stick together as a community, because you're all amazing and it's good to ask and know your options. So global market delays, I'm sure you're all aware of this, and if a medicine gets approved or there's asked for more data, there might be a time lag of 6 months or 2 years until it's actually available to patients, or it can be reimbursed. And obviously this time could change from a patient being eligible to non-eligible, and that could be a patient that's ambulant that then goes to non-ambulant, or another kind of progressive disease. So it's really important that we are collecting your real world experiences outside of the clinical trial that's meaningful to you and your family. And that might be how independent you can be and not how fast you can walk or how fast you can climb. And I think it's different for every family. So I'll come back to that on my next slide. So just wanted to touch on the current situation. I'm sure that we're all in some kind of struggle at this point, but it's just good to, I wanted to highlight some of the opportunities and some of the things that are happening in this pandemic that's encouraging to see, because I think a lot of it is obviously uncertain and stressful, and obviously acknowledging that fundraising is hard for patient groups right now. But the good things that I'm seeing that is really encouraging to hear is that you're communicating more, and that things have slowed down a bit more, and video calls are happening, certainly in our company, definitely every day, and hopefully between the patient organisations they are, because I'm hearing that you're getting to know each other better. And if you know your community and know what you want and where you want to go and the kind of access that you need, then that's only a good thing if you become more informed. And I know a lot more surveys are being done in this pandemic, so keep them going. And the one today, please fill it out. We can learn a lot from each other. And thank you for tuning in today to this webinar. Maybe you wouldn't have time to have tuned in today if we weren't in a pandemic. And I think obviously there isn't a lot of conferences that we can travel to, but that's less burdensome, less travel, and hopefully there'll be more webinars and we'll still keep learning from each other. There's a lot more technology being used, and I think that's really encouraging. I'm seeing more companies using wearables, using videos, and also patients using diaries and photos. And I'm even seeing my colleagues that are doctors and nurses doing their care assessments over Zoom and Teams and WebEx, and we're collecting data. I think it's good to reflect on life in lockdown and what can we learn from it. I know a lot of clinical trials and early access programs, I think more clinical trials have been put on hold at this stressful time, and I'm sorry to hear that, and hopefully more will be starting up again. It's important to get that data and get that access to those patients. But I am seeing home care nurses going into homes and doing clinical trials and early access programs, and I hope to see a lot more of that. So that's really encouraging. And then real world data is just so important. So collecting that clinical information outside of a clinical trial that we wouldn't normally see. People are doing diaries, they're doing videos, they're sharing their home life, and that's great to share with each other, because patient organisations can be a lot stronger together. And I just wanted to also mention that I think in general that mountains have been moved to get access to treatment and collect data for COVID-19, and I think it would be amazing if we could shift that focus to rare disease and see the same urgency and rapid access that's happening, because I think there is some similarities between the pandemic, COVID-19, and the rare diseases, and they're facing the same challenges. So, I've mentioned this a few times before, real world data. What is it? Real world data, it's often talked about as real world evidence as well. Well, we say at Bionical that it is a fundamental part of our early access programs, because of course the number one priority is getting drug to patient as fast as humanly possible, and that is our number one priority, but it's still fundamental to our programs that we're collecting that information as much as we can, and if the sponsor and the doctors want to, because we want to learn more about the treatment and we want to learn more about the disease. And this collecting real world data, it's not mandatory, it's not like a clinical trial, but it can do a lot. And I think that if we can collect as much as we can through the new technology, looking at each of your specific diseases, is it a wearable that's specific for that disease? Is actually video better for that disease? And use that and show the FDA and EMA, can it help get approved? Can it help get reimbursements? It can. I've seen it being used, and I've seen drugs being approved by looking at compassionate use data, which is really encouraging. And I think the more publications that we can get out in rare disease, the better. We can learn a lot from each other and the different populations, and it's not just that strict inclusion criteria that a clinical trial has, and it's the real life patient and family experiences that you have, and getting your voices heard and getting your information out there. Because quite frankly and simply, if this information isn't collected, it's lost. So what are the challenges in rare disease? Well, unfortunately, there's quite a lot, and that's why not every single pharmaceutical company that is developing drugs in rare disease is able to do one. But hopefully we'll see a lot more in the next coming months and years. So safety has to be paramount. That, to me as well, with my nursing background, safety cannot be compromised. And we must remember that these medications are in development, they're not approved. Some early access programs in rare disease are as early as phase 1 or phase 2, and they've only just got a little bit of safety and they need more efficacy. And we don't know how they're necessarily going to respond in the general population. So I think you always have to match the risks and the benefits, and they should be about here. And hopefully the benefits outweigh the risks, but I think the risks really need to be considered, and you need to talk to your treating doctor about the risks and how much you're willing to take and the implications for that. The patient numbers and length of access is a really tricky one, because we don't know if you're going to be on an access program for 6 months or 2 years, and nor does the company. And it's really hard because they hope that they're going to get approval, but sadly, not all of these drugs get approved, and it's really hard to know if you can be kept on that drug if you're seeing benefit if it doesn't get approval. And obviously this supply of the drug has to come back to the clinical trials, and the clinical trials are paramount, and they're so important to get these drugs approved and out to the wider population. But obviously they need to know how much drug they will have for the patients on the compassionate use. So they might only be able to spare 10 or 20 patients, but I'm a strong advocate that 20 families to help and give hope and give access is better than no families. And coming back to safety again, the same with the drug supply and clinical trials, often the companies are obviously worried that if there's a big safety event that the clinical trial and the early access program will stop and the company could fold. But I haven't seen that happen in any company. I think 2 that have been put on hold clinically to investigate a serious adverse event, and then they started up again. So that's really encouraging. So hopefully the supply of drug won't be a limiting factor. But I think administration is. I'm fortunate enough to have administered lots of different investigational medicines, and oral is quite simple. You can even have that at home, and sometimes even subcut if patients are happy to give it themselves. But obviously IV and long infusions are a little bit more complex, and with the access, do you want to give a general anaesthetic if you need a portacath or a Hitman line to have an infusion? you know, is the drug intrathecal? That's a lot more complex, and they have to have specialist sites. We have some IV and intrathecal early access programs running now, and there's a lot of complexities that comes with that. And of course, cost, everyone knows it's very expensive, drug development. And even with all the money in the world, like we're seeing now with COVID-19, it doesn't mean that you can necessarily buy health, buy a vaccine, buy the wonder drug. You know, research and development takes time. You need to go through the phases, and you can't rush that. So it is expensive, and you need to take time to develop the drugs safely and efficiently. The reimbursement is a really tricky one too, because you're not guaranteed to get reimbursed in every country, and you need to decide as the company where they're going to do the access to. And the resources, of course, if they've got the manpower and the expertise, some small pharma and large pharma, in fact, have outsourced that to companies like ourselves who have the in-house capabilities, and we're running early access program every day. We're living and breathing it. So if we've got that expertise, then that's what we're here for. Sorry, just to mention that a lot of those things are challenges, but I think that they can be mitigated if there's early planning. I think proactive early planning is really important when they're looking at their early phases, going into humans, and they're going from phase 1. They should be thinking about planning for early access, because a lot of that with drug supply and patient numbers and things like that can be mitigated with early planning. So hopefully early access programs will be a fundamental part of all the company's drug development, especially in rare disease. Right, my last slide, what you've all been here for, and Josie's going to talk a lot more about and give you some amazing case studies. But I just wanted to finish with saying, talk to each other. I really encourage you to share experiences. Go and speak to your doctors, or in fact your specialist nurses, because you probably know them very well. But it is the doctor that's requesting the drug on your behalf. It's good to engage with companies as well, regulators, NICE, HTA, and know a bit about it, understand a bit about the regulations and the hurdles and the barriers and how much time that takes. You know, you can have influence with designs of early access programs and collections of data. You know, companies do have advisory boards, and they do speak to patients. So if you can get in there early and know your community and know how to get access, then that's only a good thing, and informing yourself. I feel very strongly that clear and timely communication is vital. I've seen press releases coming out with companies and it not being always quite so clear with the patient. So I've worked with patient organisations to make more of a patient-focused document, which is a bit more of a bite-size information that they can take to their doctors and talk through early access. But I think it's really important for your doctor to know, do you want to take part in a clinical trial? Do you want to take part in an access programme? Because they need to know your kind of stance on that even before one may come up. And then just talking to each other and sharing experiences, and as much as you can share data. You know, there's tools you can share, even looking at the different rare disease economic models and live questionnaires and different kind of resources. You can save a lot of time, and companies coming together and sharing resources to get there as fast as we can. I think all doctors, all patients, all families, all companies like us that are working in rare disease, we all have the same goal. We want to get as many treatments approved safely and ethically as quickly as possible. And we're all in a race against time, and we're just in different pathways, and we just need to come together and share our expertise and our backgrounds and our experiences. And I truly believe that together we're stronger.
Hi, so I'm Josie. Godfrey. Thank you, Naomi. Really interesting introduction to the ridiculously complex topic of early access programs. I'm going to speak today on behalf of Metabolic Support UK, where I'm a trustee, but just by way of background, I've worked in rare diseases for over 10 years now, having set up the highly specialised technology programme at NICE, worked with a number of patient organisations, industry, NHS, trade bodies, all around policy and access for rare diseases. So I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. I'm just going to move my slides. So just briefly about Metabolic Support UK. They're an umbrella charity focused on inherited metabolic disorders, of which there are hundreds, so please don't ask me to name them. And they provide information, particularly important for people who've just received a diagnosis, and also support, peer support and support for individuals and families who are affected by metabolic conditions. They work with a lot of other patient organisations. They also help those, particularly which do not have a disease-specific patient organisation, and work with patients to build communities within individual disorders. Also very involved on the policy side with the Department of Health and with NHS England around diagnosis, screening, and of course supporting access to new treatments. So it's just a little bit about them. So what do early access schemes mean to patients? Well, with three phrases here that we hear a lot: hope, life-saving and life-changing. They really do offer hope to patients who typically have no other treatments available, or are very ineffective or limited treatments available, and can make a real difference, particularly with those with progressive conditions that may result otherwise in permanent disability or even death whilst people wait for access to promising new treatments. So I've been asked to talk just a little about two case studies that Metabolic Support UK have been involved in. The first, an early access to medicine scheme. You'll note the capital letters. That's a very formal scheme for X-linked hypophosphatemia. And the second is for compassionate use. It's a less formal scheme for Strensiq or aspartase alpha for hyperphosphasia. Two diseases that I'm forever muddling up the names, so I'm going to stick, I think, to the acronyms of XLH and HPP. I hope you'll forgive me. Here is an overview from the MHRA, so the Medicines Regulator in the UK, of the Emas scheme. Don't worry if you can't read it. All you need to know is that it's a very long process. It can take a number of years from the first discussion to actual decision. And you'll also see that the patients don't get much of a mention on it. So there's a slightly different way of looking at it when you can see that there's different stages of engagement, potentially 12 to 18 months of data collection. And then it goes into nice official technology appraisal or highly specialized technology. So that is the route for long-term or routine commissioning and reimbursement of a product. But the Emas scheme starts much earlier and potentially can run for 12 to 18 months. It's a very formal, structured scheme, as I say, designed to fill that gap, particularly for those severe conditions which don't perhaps have another treatment or another satisfactory treatment. What it isn't is an open-ended scheme that anyone can get access to a product indefinitely. It's designed to finish at the point of license. Then a lot of discussions take place to try to see if we can bridge the gap between a license from Europe or from the MHRA and a NICE approval. So what happened with XLH was that there was an early access program, very formal. It went through Emas, went through the MHRA. And Metabolic Support UK were very involved in advisory board discussions, very involved with the company, actually advising on what are the appropriate patient cohorts for access, what are the qualification criteria, the entry criteria for a scheme, who are the priorities and which patients are most going to want to receive treatment, also where might they need to receive treatment. This was the first new treatment in 30 years. The previous treatment, the current treatment at that time, was an incredibly demanding regime with unsatisfactory results for many patients. Actually involved taking treatment every 6 hours, very restricted, people losing sleep and really struggling to manage the dose, and a high risk of complications and side effects. So this new product was very welcomed by clinicians, welcomed by patients, and ultimately did result in positive NICE decision. So the early access program was put in place. It enabled access for children, for young people, and that was extended while NICE guidance was implemented, whilst it was approved, whilst it was implemented, which meant we didn't have a hard cutoff and then a gap where patients maybe did not receive treatment or were anxious about not receiving treatment while NICE reached a longer term decision. In this case, they were actually able to approve it straight away for children and young people. But the evidence that was collected helped inform that discussion, helped inform that decision taken by NICE. There was good uptake, the communication was very good with clinicians, with the company, and patients were well informed, which isn't always the case. So just going to try and, I think I've skipped ahead. So in HPP, so hyperphosphatemia, also no treatment, even worse condition, no treatment. Number of forms of the condition, but effectively its infantile form is very life-threatening, very high mortality rate for babies, anyone who presents with the condition before 6 months of age. And aspartase alpha, the first treatment, was life-saving and life-changing treatment. And I know Rick's going to share a video online after this showing just the impact that it had on just one child and one family. But absolutely fundamental game changer for this condition. Unfortunately, there was no fast route to access, and the NICE process was slow, very worrying for patients. The compassionate use program was put in place by the company, which did give patients hope. Unfortunately, it wasn't a formal program. It wasn't set up within the Emas framework. It wasn't set up within an NHS commissioning policy framework. So it was very much individual patients having to know, having to find a clinician willing to reach out to the company, and the company making a decision, which obviously left a lot of uncertainty and concern for patients about what would happen going forward, what would happen if NICE did not approve the product, what would happen if there was a gap, what would happen if the company decided to not grant access for these very small number of very vulnerable children. It was far from satisfactory from a patient perspective, and certainly from a patient group perspective, and didn't allow that same degree of generating data, generating new understanding of the condition. So we've noticed barriers to the design of these schemes, and I mentioned a couple already, that companies face barriers, as Naomi has said. There's limited supply of these products, usually in the gap between trial or during trial and license and full production of the launch of the product. There are ethical issues around who's going to get the treatment and actually being able to maintain treatment for an appropriate duration. There's concern that the safety data could be compromised. So as you move from the very carefully controlled terms of a clinical trial into general population, companies are understandably concerned that perhaps it's not the right patients who are receiving the right kind of treatment done in those controlled conditions could actually impact on their ability to get a license, to get marketing authorization for a treatment. And Naomi's touched on that. Companies can also be really worried about talking to patient groups, particularly before a treatment has a license. They mustn't engage in anything that could be seen as promotional activity, which can make it really challenging when you're trying to create a system that actually gets access to patients. So quite often they don't have a lot of information and find it quite difficult. Certainly when Naomi and her team, I know, do a lot of work with companies to help them overcome that particular barrier. It's something patient groups can do as well. And stakeholders generally may have very limited knowledge of the disease. We know this in rare diseases and of the patient community. We looked at the screen earlier and found the patients were not listed. They weren't shown there as a fundamental stakeholder in the design of the Emas scheme, so the Early Access to Medicine scheme. And often companies do not know the patient community in a given country. NHS England and NICE certainly wouldn't know the disease or the patient community unless there were already well-established treatments and services. And this can result in, frankly, poorly designed early access programs with selection criteria that maybe just not meet the needs of the patient community in the country, and maybe provided at centres that would not necessarily be the best centres for patients to be attending during that time. There are also barriers around implementation. So poor communications is the key that we've certainly seen a lot. Companies can only provide very limited information, particularly around compassionate use programs, named patient programs. Clinicians and patients may be completely unaware of the details of this scheme, of the possibility of such a scheme, and may not always feel comfortable or confident to actually ask for access to treatment. supply issues I've mentioned, but also there's a clinical and administrative burden of setting these things in place. Even though the treatment may be free of charge and the NHS is not charged for that treatment, that doesn't mean that there are no implications for a service, no implications for the clinical team in terms of having to administer the treatment, screen for the treatment, and actually find the time and capacity to deal with that. The simpler a scheme, the much easier it is to introduce and implement. So MSUK, Metabolic Support UK, have taken a number of approaches to overcoming these barriers. And I know Liz is going to talk in a lot of detail about SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and the approach that they've taken and their success in getting an early access program. But at a high level, rather than in detail, with all stakeholders, MSUK is able to bring either directly because they hold that knowledge or working with individual patient communities, expertise on the condition and on the patients. So both on the disease, but also what do patients want from a treatment? What do they need in order to be able to access a treatment? Focus very much on bringing solutions, not problems, and embracing opportunity to gather real world data. It's such an opportunity to understand more about a treatment, but also more about the patients that you're representing, and to get real data that can help inform nice processes and discussions with NHS England and indeed in Scotland about how products can be made available more routinely over time once they've got that license, can really help them. With companies, Metabolic Support UK approaches them early. It is probably never too early to be talking to companies you know working in your disease area, and never too early to say, will you be considering an early access program? So approach early, but also set in place a formal agreement. Metabolic Support UK will sign a formal agreement. It protects the confidentiality of discussions and allows comfort on all sides that they can speak freely, speak openly, and actually make real progress. It also suggests that there's ethical input into any scheme. This is particularly important if treatment might stop, if it's not approved, for example, for reimbursement in the UK. And there's a group, beta group, bioethics advisory group, that has a lot of input from patients and the companies can reach out to. We work with clinicians, educating on the scheme, so learning obviously from them about the disease, but also educating on what the scheme is and what the patients need to be able to participate in it, and what they may need to do in order to get access for their patients. And finally, with patients, communication is key. Ensuring people understand that there is a scheme, what the scheme means, and also the limitations. So if there are patients who would not be eligible to participate, but may later on be able to benefit from a treatment, and also whether or not it is for a finite period of time. So how long will patients be able to be guaranteed treatment through a scheme before NICE and SMC in Scotland have reached final decisions about reimbursement? So those are the key activities that we have undertaken and routinely do. And now I'm going to hand over to Liz to talk in a lot more detail about SMA.
Right, in case any of you haven't gathered, I am not familiar with presenting at webinars, but I will do my best today. I'm from Spinal Muscular Atrophy UK. We're a small charity. It's not as small as many, I'm aware. We have 4 to 5 staff who work in the support services team, and it's an organisation that's been around for a long time. So SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, is a rare genetically inherited neuromuscular condition. It results in progressive muscle weakness and loss of movement due to muscle wasting. Its most common form, 5q SMA, has traditionally been clinically classified by type, with type 1 the most severe. And that's what I'm talking about. This was an early access program for nusinersen type 1. In type 1, the symptoms and effects usually begin from birth or within the first few weeks or months of life. And without intervention for breathing difficulties, life expectancy has been less than 2 years. In 2017, it was estimated that some 45 babies were born with SMA type 1 each year. And the SMA community, not just type 1, is a population of about 1,200 to 1,500 across the UK. So that gives you an idea of the disease spectrum. So the drug treatment that was the subject of the EAP, the Expanded Access Programme, was nusinersen, also known as Spinraza, and it's the first treatment ever for SMA. It is not a cure, and that's really important to know, and it's not how it was necessarily heard by people when it first came through. It's a highly specialised medicine, and it's manufactured by pharmaceutical company Biogen. It's delivered by lumbar puncture by a series of 4 loading doses within the first 63 days of treatment, and then once every 4 months for life. As such, it has a significant administration cost. We're talking about clinical expertise, theatre space, physio assessment of outcomes, pharmaceutical involvement. There's a lot of costs over and above the drug, and the drug itself was extremely expensive as well. In autumn 2016, the India clinical trial results of 120 children with SMA type 1 were released. They were sufficiently positive for Biogen to end the trial early and for all children in the trial to be transferred to the treatment. And at that time, Biogen also opened their global expanded access program. So it was a global program. This provided the drug free of charge with a view to the program closing on a country-by-country basis as reimbursement or payment to Biogen for the drug was agreed. By January 2017, so that's a period of 3 or 4 months, the EAP had opened in many countries, but it was only beginning in the UK at Gosh, which had been a trial centre. Though the drug was free, the NHS trusts didn't have the funds or capacity to cover the administration costs of delivering the treatment. By this time, understandably, desperate families had already started to travel to Europe to access the treatment via the EAP at considerable cost to themselves, and with all the stress and risks of travelling with a sick child. But of course, not everyone was in a position to do this. So there began a huge amount of advocacy work from clinicians and patient groups with support from MPs to open the EAP in the UK. One powerful advocate that I particularly recall was a parent whose 7-month-old daughter died in early March 2017, waiting for treatment, an unimaginably painful position to be in. The EAP soon opened in Northern Ireland and Scotland, but it took until August 2017 for NHS England to announce an interim policy that provided new funding to cover the NHS trusts. However, even then, the policy limited access and England still didn't align with the global programme. And it took further advocacy by clinicians and patient groups to get full access by March 2018. During this time, some clinicians in centres that had got the programme up and running negotiated with their trusts to take influence from other parts of the country. But again, this meant travelling and stress for families and often delays in starting treatment. Some babies who would have had treatment and early access in other countries died. It was a hugely stressful and emotional time. The programme closed in May 2018, following the decision there for the Scottish NHS to fund treatment for infants with SMA type 1. But in England, the story was again different. NICE's appraisal process had started in January 2017 and was still not completed. There were more than 80 children on the programme in the UK, and Biogen advised that this was the most for any country in the world and that they had reached the limit of their willingness to continue to support the NHS. Due largely, therefore, to their frustrations with the NICE process and despite our frantic lobbying, urging Biogen not to use children and families as pawns, they closed the programme to new infants in England, Northern Ireland and Wales on the 1st of November 2018. In May 2019, NICE made a seemingly positive recommendation for access, and Biogen committed to reopen the EAP for infants newly diagnosed with SMA type 1 in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, up until the new guidance and what would then become a managed access agreement was finally published on the 24th of July 2019. So there was, again, lots of hope and promise, but the reality was this bridging programme didn't really get going. So for all that time, newly diagnosed children had no access to this treatment. So what was our role in all this? We were only one group. There were other patient groups as well, MD UK and Treat SMA and the clinicians, and together our role was huge and pivotal. It ranged from presenting evidence from surveys about the impact of SMA and the need for treatment to NICE and NHS England, to joint patient group and clinician open letters to the media. There were letters to MPs, ministers and key people in NICE and NHS England, and representations at all party parliamentary groups. Many families told their stories to national and local media. We had to explain what SMA is, why this treatment mattered, and be as succinct as possible. Because there's so much noise out there, it was the only way to attract attention. The patient groups all worked in different ways for the same end, and we also regularly met jointly with Biogen. Some of the work was very public and campaigning in nature. Some was confidential and behind the scenes. For example, in 2018, I was a patient rep who was part of a confidential NHS England working party, working with trusts on resolving complex access and funding issues, identifying individual children and working on getting them access. This included the complexity of bringing families home for treatment from Europe in a way that didn't queue jump over newly diagnosed infants or those who hadn't had the means and resources to travel. And also it involved tracking individual trusts' rollout of the programme to see where the blockages were and to try and unpick those. And also, of course, all that time, SMA UK was supporting many very distressed families. So the biggest challenges we faced during this time were firstly, that we were an information and support organisation first and foremost. All the advocacy work fell on the support services team on top of already busy workloads. We had kept a bit of an eye on clinical trials and drug developments, but we were all social workers, OTs and nurses by background. My background is social work. I come from a social view of disability. This was an absolute first for me. We weren't scientifically oriented, and we definitely didn't have a clue, never heard of the UK regulatory system, and had never worked with pharmaceutical companies. We didn't have a press office, and we weren't media savvy, and we didn't have a CEO who could take that lead either. So we were very pushed. We were supporting people desperate for access who were going overseas, but we were also aware of the problems this could bring, the financial burden and risks of travelling with a sick child. How would they fit back in the system when the treatment was reimbursed here? And when treatment started to roll out in the UK, we were also supporting families caught by that postcode lottery. Families also had huge expectations of the treatment, due often to social media reports from families that had seen great results. And sadly, these weren't met for all. We were also constantly updating our website and writing social media notices to keep the community informed about developments in as careful, accurate way as possible, and that was hugely time consuming. We would agonize over the words, particularly due to the expectations of the community. We were also working to empower the community to be involved and have their voices heard. So we were often drafting template letters to MPs and others, and working with MD UK in particular to gain access to all party parliamentary groups and MP drop-ins. Life for us was complicated by the birth of another patient group, Treat SMA, with a more upfront media and lobbying style, not encumbered by the service responsibilities we had or our more complex relationships with regulatory authorities and clinicians, and not bound by confidentiality in the same way we were. This was a hugely important grassroots movement that families could get behind and not be limited in any way in the actions they could take, but it was at times difficult for us. Much of our work was with individuals and NHS England to gain access. It couldn't be shared. Often even the family themselves didn't always know what negotiation we were taking part in on their behalf, in view of our concerns about unduly raising hopes of access. At times to the community, it may well have looked as if we had dropped the ball. So I was asked to think about top tips, and it feels quite patronising to even think that we could give top tips, and many of these will be very obvious or known to you. But from my perspective, looking back, first of all, as quickly as possible, get familiar with the regulatory system and terminology as early as possible. I saw a question flash across the screen a little while ago. What is reimbursement? I'd never heard of that term, and it was very difficult to ask, and that was one of many. As far as possible, understand the clinical trial results. Again, completely new for many people. Knowing your community and what the need is and keeping them informed. I think we did fairly well on that, and many of you will be so connected with your community it won't be an issue. But again, you need to keep so much in touch. Work with the clinicians and endeavour to align your advocacy. They are the people who the pharmaceutical company and NICE and NHS England will really listen to, and they're the people who have tried and tested the drug and will in the end be administering it. Know what's happening more globally. We were lucky we had SMA Europe, which links us in with many countries, and it was really important to understand that global context. Families were more switched on than we were because of all their social media connections, and clearly they knew quickly where to travel for treatment. And that's become even more of an issue now with crowdfunding and people trying to get access to drugs overseas as soon as they know they're possible. I think working with the pharmaceutical company, obviously very important, and it went well, but also keep your distance and cancel. My goodness, that's misspelled. There are at least two sides to the negotiations taking place with NICE and NHS England. Try to work with the other patient groups if you have more than one in the area you're working with, and recognise each other's styles and strengths. Don't let it become a destructive competition, which it can do. And I think in an arena of tight funding and a lot going on, that's always a possibility. I'd say don't underestimate your power, but equally don't overestimate your influence. There are many people involved and many confidential talks taking place between influential people working in a highly complex regulatory area. Fight for your drug and your community, but consider equity of process and practice. There are many, many conditions, drugs, and many people in need. And that was always salutary to think about the wider context of the fight that we were in. Recognise that emotions run high, and understandably for families, they really do run high, and it can be an exhausting area to be working in. Trying to manage expectations, I've mentioned that already. It wasn't unusual, for example, for a clinician to say, I talked to the parents for an hour about the treatment really carefully, and at the end, they still think it's a cure. Getting to grips with clinical outcomes, measures, economic models of cost effectiveness, all new terms. Again, get ready for those, they come next. I think Naomi mentioned the outcome, how important the outcomes of an EAP are. We used a lot of what we saw in our surveys and that we then submitted to NICE as the drug went into the next stage. So in summary, this is one story, but each drug and early access program follows very different path. And we're actually now embarking on different ones again with SMA, 2 drugs called Zolgensma and Risdiplam, and both are following very different routes. So I hope that all came across okay.
Liz, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for giving a really nice detailed overview of the work that you did. It gives a fantastic representation of a real challenging situation that you went through, and I don't think anyone finds your comments or tips remotely patronising. It's really insightful, and the value of someone who's been through the process sharing that can't be understated. So really do appreciate that. Broadly as well, I just want to thank the other speakers. We're going to go back to all of us now just to go through some of these top tips that both Josie and Naomi would give for patient engagement. Hopefully what we've done so far is give you a bit more of a sense of the value of these EAPs, how they can be a really nice route for you to find a way to get access to treatments for patients early on, but that they are challenging and they are really the first step and gateway into what can often be quite a long process to secure reimbursement and access for your drug for that wider community. So I think all of the tips that Liz has touched on there are really important, and key is always going to be communication. So Josie and Naomi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the top tips and how patient groups can get involved.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Liz. Fascinating to hear your experience of something I very much watched from the other side. So we've just tried to compress a couple of key themes really for the top tips. Talk early, talk often. I think I cannot stress enough. Do not wait for the company to come to you, for NHS England to come to you, for anyone to come to you. It really is in your gift to talk early, talk often with all other parties. Know your disease and patient population. You probably already do know them really well. It's certainly challenging for Metabolic Support UK with hundreds of different disorders. But know your disease, know your patient population, know what you don't know, and ask them, talk to them. That is your power in these discussions and in these negotiations. And if you don't know your patient population or don't understand your knowledge of patient population, you may find yourself on the back foot. So cannot stress it enough. Data, information is power. And communicate the agreement to patients and clinicians, I would say. We touched on some of the restrictions that companies face in communicating around some of these schemes. And actually, there's nothing better than the patient community being able to explain what's going on in their own terms, in language everybody understands, and able to respond and upfront deal with the concerns and questions people might have. And I think for me, those are if you can manage those 3 things, you're going to be streets ahead when it comes to early access programs, and also when it comes to those access discussions with NICE and that engagement around longer term reimbursement, by which we mean NHS funding. For a new treatment. Naomi, I'm not sure what you wanted to add, but I'm sure it's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that, we've discussed the main 3 top areas. I wouldn't want to say too much more and confuse, but I suppose just to kind of add that don't underestimate the power of patient organisations. Have your voice heard, and like Liz beautifully put, sharing the experiences is just, I think, gold dust, because starting what Liz said at the beginning of that journey, it was very challenging and wasn't sure about a lot of the terminology, a lot of the regulations. It is confusing. I find it confusing. I'm working in it every day, and it's different in every country, and it's different with every pathway that you might get access to. So I do think having a look at the regulations, having a look at the terminology so that you're equipped with that, and then speaking to each other, and like Josie just said, engage early. The earlier the better, so that you're prepared. Speak to your doctors, because they're the ones that request the access for you. So if they know that you want to take part in a clinical trial and that you understand the risks and you understand the implications for that, then they'll know that they can obviously approach you and discuss that. And if you want to take part in an early access program, again, discuss that, because there's so many implications, and depending on what site is doing the early access programs and the clinical trials, there might be travel involved, costs involved, and other things to just consider. So I mean, I agree, they're the three main things really: talking to each other, knowing your area, and communicating with the right people. So again, if we can help with anything, we've got resources, publications and articles we can share with you, and just if there's anything else that isn't clear, please ask, because that's what we're here for, to help.
And I think that's what we'd like to ask you really is what are you missing? What would you need to feel confident going forwards in and working with companies and others to develop an early access program, or to communicate with your patient community? Find a Cure, Metabolic Support UK, Bionical, we're here to help. But we need to know what we need to do to help you. So be really interested in your thoughts, Rick.
So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all the speakers that came on today, and also to the participants.
Absolutely, thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Naomi, Josie and Liz. It's been a really interesting webinar, and your opinions and ideas and learning has been really appreciated. So we do thank you for your time.